Did you hear the news 3 minutes ago? Because if you didn't, you might still be trying to catch up. Meghan Markle has just made a move that no one in the royal circle, or in the tabloids, expected. The palace has officially announced a decision that could rewrite the rules of royalty forever, stripping her and Harry of their royal titles. And in the blink of an eye, Meghan was on her way to the UK. But why? What drove this sudden flight? And what exactly is happening behind the palace gates that cameras will never show us? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine the scene. A private jet, lights flashing, security on edge. Inside, Meghan is not calm. Far from it. Every second is ticking louder than the last. This isn't just about titles. This is about legacy, reputation, family, and survival under a microscope that the world never lets rest. Think about it. You're a woman who married into the most scrutinized family on the planet, and suddenly, in a matter of minutes, the very institution that once promised protection now threatens to erase your official status. How would you react? Panic? Anger? Determination? Meghan did something else entirely, something bold, decisive, and undeniably public. This isn't the first time the Sussexes have clashed with the palace. We've seen interviews, public statements, and even a memoir in the works. But this is immediate, raw, and explosive. The palace isn't just voicing disapproval, they are acting. And Meghan's response? It's as swift as it is shocking. Within minutes, she's boarding a plane, leaving Los Angeles behind, racing toward London. There's a story in every glance, every movement, every whispered word that doesn't make the headlines. Why does this matter now? Because timing is everything. The palace's announcement wasn't a routine update or a ceremonial adjustment. It was a public statement, a signal to the world that even royalty isn't untouchable, and even those who married into the family aren't immune to its rules. But Meghan's move, her rapid deployment back to the UK, flips the narrative entirely. She's no longer just a recipient of the palace's decisions. She is actively engaging, challenging, and yes, controlling the story in real time. Let's take a moment to consider the stakes. We're not talking about a minor ceremonial title. These are royal titles that come with historical weight, social prestige, and public recognition. Stripping them isn't just symbolic, it's a message. It's a line drawn in the sand. And Meghan? She didn't wait for commentary, speculation, or approval. She acted. Fast. She boarded a plane not with calm resignation, but with a clear purpose and possibly a strategy that even palace insiders couldn't anticipate. And the public? We're watching, glued to screens, scrolling social media, retweeting, sharing, debating. Every news outlet has its version, but none capture the immediacy, the tension, the human drama in that private jet. You feel it, you imagine it, and you wonder what happens next. What conversations are happening behind closed doors? Who's furious? Who's fearful? Who's scrambling to respond? Think about it. 3 minutes ago, the world shifted. In the time it took you to sip your coffee, Meghan was already airborne. By the time the palace press office released its statement, she had made a calculated move that changes the narrative entirely. The headlines scream about betrayal and protocol. Social media erupts with judgment and support in equal measure. The palace staff scramble. Allies and insiders weigh in. And Meghan? She sits in the cabin, focused, determined, perhaps imagining every reaction that will ripple across London and beyond. But what's driving her? Is it fear, anger, loyalty, or strategy? Likely all of it. This is a woman who understands power, optics, and timing better than most. She knows how quickly a story can twist, and she knows that inaction in this moment could mean losing more than titles. It could mean losing control entirely. She's stepping into the storm deliberately, confronting an institution that once enveloped her in both fascination and scrutiny. And yet, there's a twist. The palace's announcement, while official, is incomplete. There's nuance in the language, and in Meghan's world, nuance is everything. While the statement threatens removal of titles, it leaves room for interpretation, negotiation, and, potentially, retaliation. Meghan, understanding this better than anyone, is preparing to act within that gray zone. The world will see her arrival in London as dramatic. But the truth, behind doors, in halls, in private conversations, is far more intricate, far more tense, far more dangerous. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be at the center of a decision that reverberates across continents, affects billions of viewers, and challenges centuries of protocol? Meghan is living that reality. And in this introduction, we're not just setting the stage, we're stepping into the room with her. We're going to see what happens when headlines collide with human emotion, when protocol clashes with instinct, when history meets immediacy. Now, consider the questions that are going to follow us through this story. How will the palace respond to a Sussex who refuses to wait? How will Harry navigate his own emotions, alliances, and obligations? And what does this mean for the monarchy itself, an institution that thrives on tradition and careful control, when faced with someone who moves at the speed of controversy? In this story, every second counts. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered conversation carries weight. And every decision Meghan makes is scrutinized, analyzed, and debated, not just by the public, but by an institution that has its own long memory and rigid rules. But here's the shocking part. What the world doesn't yet know is that Meghan's flight, her rapid decision to return to the UK, was only the beginning. What she did next, behind closed doors, in corridors where cameras cannot reach, will not only challenge the palace's authority, but also set off a chain of events that nobody saw coming. Allies will be tested. Loyalties will be questioned, and the narrative that the world thinks it understands will unravel in ways that are both fascinating and terrifying. So hold on. Because this isn't just a story about titles, planes, or announcements. It's a story about power, strategy, courage, and the human heart under extraordinary pressure. And as you watch this unfold, ask yourself, what would you do if your entire life, your identity, and your legacy were suddenly up for negotiation? How far would you go to reclaim control? How much risk could you take before the consequences became too great? And just as you start to imagine that, remember this. What comes next will not just answer those questions. It will explode them in ways that no one expected. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. No one saw it coming, except maybe Meghan. The palace announcement had dropped like a thunderclap across London, New York, and Los Angeles. Royal titles revoked. Public roles in limbo. And within minutes, Meghan Markle was airborne, heading straight for the UK. But why would she act so fast? What was the urgency that turned a calculated life of privacy and media control into a literal sprint across the Atlantic? Imagine it. The engines roar, the cabin lights dim, and Meghan sits there, every nerve alert, scanning messages, calls, and alerts on her phone. Every notification could be a new bombshell. Every minute delayed could cost her control. For someone like Meghan, control is everything. She knows the palace moves slowly, weighed down by centuries of tradition, protocol, and optics. But Meghan? She moves at a speed that the monarchy is still struggling to comprehend. The announcement itself was brutal. Stripped of titles. No formal explanation for the timing. No acknowledgement of past services. Just a cold, precise, public statement that carried the weight of centuries of power. In a world where every word is dissected, this statement was a declaration of authority. And it was personal. But the palace didn't count on Meghan. They didn't anticipate that instead of retreating into media silence or private counsel, she would act immediately. She didn't wait for lawyers, advisors, or press releases. She didn't wait for public opinion to form or for social media to explode. She made a decision that can only be described as audacious and potentially explosive. Inside the jet, Meghan's thoughts raced faster than the plane itself. Every second mattered. Every decision was a calculation of optics and consequence. She knew the palace would interpret delay as weakness, hesitation as submission. And Meghan Markle does not submit when her identity, family, and legacy are on the line. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the palace staff scrambled. The statement had already leaked online. Headlines screamed betrayal and scandal. Public reaction was immediate. Supporters flooded social media with praise for her courage. Critics hurled judgment. Somewhere in the halls of Buckingham Palace, advisors and aides tried to anticipate her next move. But the truth is, no one could have. Meghan had already taken it. This is where strategy meets instinct. Some would argue that rushing to London was reckless, exposing herself to public scrutiny, media traps, and palace security measures. But Meghan knows how to wield visibility like a weapon. She understood that arrival timing could reset the narrative, put pressure on the palace, and create a sense of urgency that even centuries of royal tradition could not resist. And yet, there's contradiction here. Meghan is someone who has meticulously curated her public image, someone who has built layers of privacy, security, and calculated exposure. Why take such a visible, audacious step now? The answer is complex, emotional, and tense. This is not just about titles. It's about identity, loyalty, and the fight for narrative control. Every glance at her phone, every conversation on the plane, every moment of reflection is part of a larger chess game with stakes higher than most of us can imagine. Meanwhile, Harry is a storm of emotion on his own. Watching Meghan board a plane, racing toward the UK, he must balance instinct, duty, and love. What does he say to family members who may feel betrayed? What does he communicate to the press without giving away strategy? What does he do while the world watches, judging every move? The layers of tension are staggering. One misstep, and the media spins it as drama, scandal, or worse, failure. But this is not failure. This is strategic action at its most intense. The plane descends into London under a sky that seems to mirror the tension. Clouds dark and heavy, as if foreshadowing the storm waiting on the ground. Meghan knows that upon arrival, the palace corridors, private chambers, and hidden passageways will be battlegrounds of protocol, persuasion, and power. And every moment counts. A misplaced word, a wrong expression, a misunderstood gesture could shift the narrative in an instant. Inside those corridors, unseen by cameras and unrecorded by microphones, decisions are being made at a breakneck pace. Advisors whisper strategies, courtiers anticipate reactions, security personnel coordinate every movement. And Meghan? She's aware of it all, calculating, observing, and ready to act. Every step is measured, every word poised to influence, every expression analyzed. Think about the public perception. Millions of people are watching, forming opinions based on headlines, photos, and rumors. They think they understand. They think they know, but they don't. The truth, as always, lives behind the walls, in conversations no one sees, intentions no one hears. And Meghan is not just a participant in this moment. She is a force shaping it. And then there's the emotional dimension. Fear, excitement, anger, love, determination. Every emotion blends, creating a pressure cooker environment. Meghan is navigating centuries of tradition, centuries of protocol, centuries of scrutiny, all while asserting her own agency. Every heartbeat, every breath, every choice carries weight. The human stakes are as high as the institutional ones. But there's another layer. History. The monarchy is an institution built on precedent, hierarchy, and continuity. Breaking protocol is not just frowned upon. It is a disruption to centuries of expectation. And Meghan's flight? It is a deliberate disruption, a direct challenge to that order. The palace may react with statements, whispers, and maneuvers, but Meghan has already altered the course of events. The ripple effect will be felt across corridors of power, media rooms, and social platforms alike. And yet, for all the strategy and calculation, there is an unpredictability. What happens when human emotion meets institutional power? When courage clashes with centuries of tradition? When visibility meets secrecy? This is where the drama intensifies. This is where Meghan's story is not just a headline. It is a living, breathing, high-stakes saga that unfolds in real time. By the time she steps off the plane, the stakes have shifted. The palace is aware, the media is watching, and public opinion is in flux. Every eye is on her, every whisper analyzed, every photograph dissected. And yet, Meghan is not reacting. She is anticipating. She is controlling. She is shaping the narrative even as the world thinks it is watching it unfold. And here's the real question. What will happen when the first words are exchanged? When Meghan walks into those private chambers, confronts family members, advisors, and perhaps even the monarch herself, what will be said? What will be revealed? And how will the balance of power shift in the moments that follow? But the palace is not passive. Behind those ornate doors, a series of calculated responses is already underway. Plans are being drawn, allies briefed, and contingencies prepared. Meghan's arrival is a challenge, but it is also an opportunity for the institution to reassert control. Every strategy is on the table, every conversation weighed, every reaction anticipated. And yet, for all the calculation, one truth remains: nothing is predictable. In a house built on tradition, Meghan is an unpredictable force. She moves fast, acts decisively, and understands the optics of every gesture. She knows that timing, emotion, and perception are weapons in this high-stakes game. So as the plane lands, engines roar, and the doors open, the story is only beginning. Everyone watching, inside and outside the palace, senses that something monumental is about to happen. And as Meghan steps into the corridors of power, one thought dominates. Every decision, every word, every glance from this point forward could change the course of history, or at least the perception of it. And what happened next inside those private chambers? That is a story that the world has only begun to imagine. But one thing is certain: the next move would not just shock the palace, it would shock everyone. And as Meghan walked those halls, all eyes on her, one question lingered in the air: who truly holds power when tradition meets defiance? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. She didn't wait. Not a second. The moment the plane touched down in London, Meghan Markle was already moving. Walking through airport corridors with an urgency that seemed to bend time itself. Every step, every glance, was measured. Security personnel flanked her discreetly, but the real tension wasn't in the logistics. It was in the emotional storm that followed her across every tile, every escalator, every shadowed corner. Why rush? Why not pause, plan, or let public opinion simmer? Because in this game, hesitation is weakness. The palace had thrown down a gauntlet, stripping titles, redefining roles, and signaling that even the most visible royals were not untouchable. Meghan understood that every second delayed would allow the palace to solidify control, craft narratives, and dictate the terms of engagement. Waiting was never an option. Not now. Inside her mind, calculations ran faster than the plane's engines. Every advisor she trusted, every friend who had supported her in the past, was now a link in a complex chain of strategy. She knew how to communicate without revealing too much. She knew how to be seen but not fully exposed. And she knew that the palace, steeped in centuries of hierarchy, could be manipulated with timing, optics, and presence. Meanwhile, the press outside was a frenzy. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed, reporters speculated, and the world tried desperately to catch a glimpse of Meghan, the figure at the center of every headline for weeks, months, years. Social media erupted. Memes, tweets, live blogs, everyone had an opinion. Some cheered her courage. Others condemned her audacity. And somewhere in the chaos, Meghan remained focused, composed, decisive. She had to be. One misstep now could undo everything she had built. The irony was palpable. She had spent years learning the rules, understanding the monarchy's rituals, adapting to its expectations. Yet now, the very institution she once navigated so carefully was the one she challenged. And that challenge required more than courage. It demanded precision, timing, and an almost preternatural sense of reading the room. Even Harry, who had anticipated some form of confrontation, was stunned by her immediacy. Calls and messages had crossed the Atlantic, each one charged with emotion, strategy, and urgency. She's moving faster than anyone imagined, he reportedly thought. Every second counts, and she knows it. Their partnership, always a balance of love and tactical alliance, now became a synchronized operation. Every decision she made would influence his own moves, and vice versa. As Meghan's convoy moved through London streets, she was aware of the palace's gaze. Surveillance, insiders, aides. Everyone was anticipating her arrival. Every vehicle, every route, every face along the way was part of a network of observation. And yet, she moved with a deliberate calm that masked a storm of emotion. Fear, determination, anger, defiance, and strategy collided inside her, creating a perfect storm of human intensity. She arrived at a discreet location near the palace, far from the public eye, but close enough to the heart of power to command attention. This was where decisions would be made, conversations had, alliances tested, and the balance of influence challenged. Courtiers, aides, and advisors were already in motion, arranging rooms, preparing for her presence, and trying to anticipate what would happen next. But Meghan had already anticipated them. She had rehearsed this moment internally, envisioning every scenario, preparing for every potential confrontation. Inside, the tension was electric. Rooms that usually held quiet deliberation now buzzed with anticipation. Every whisper carried weight. Every gesture was analyzed. And Meghan, walking into these spaces, was a force of focus and presence that few could match. She understood the optics of every moment, the emotional undercurrents of every conversation, and the subtle power dynamics at play. She wasn't just present. She was commanding attention, shaping narrative, and asserting influence before a word was even spoken. And then came the private conversations. Doors closed. Voices lowered. The palace hierarchy met with Meghan, trying to assert authority, convey expectation, and re-establish control. But Meghan had her own agenda. She spoke carefully, measured, but with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Every phrase was crafted to assert her position without triggering immediate backlash. Every sentence balanced emotion, fact, and strategic pressure. Yet the emotional stakes were higher than anyone could anticipate. Family members, long accustomed to silent protocol, now faced a force that refused to bow. Anger, fear, frustration, and loyalty swirled together in ways that created both confrontation and unexpected connection. Courtiers whispered, aides worried, and the media waited outside for even the smallest clue. But the real drama unfolded in moments the public would never see. The glances exchanged, the subtle gestures, the unspoken challenges, and the quiet but piercing assertions of agency. Meghan's presence was a calculated disruption. The palace had expected someone cautious, someone who might plead, negotiate slowly, or attempt private reconciliation. Instead, they got immediacy, decisiveness, and an unmistakable refusal to be sidelined. She had transformed the expected narrative. She had rewritten the first act of this high-stakes drama with nothing more than her arrival, her posture, and her focus. And the tension wasn't just emotional. There were logistical, legal, and symbolic dimensions as well. Titles, roles, historical precedent, all of it hung in the air, ready to collide with her actions. The palace needed time to respond, but Meghan had already acted. Time was no longer in their favor. Every moment she delayed would erode their leverage. Every calculated step she took would increase hers. Outside, the world speculated. Headlines blared, social media debated, and pundits argued about what her arrival meant. Yet none of it captured the reality of what was happening behind closed doors. Meghan knew that public perception was a tool, sometimes an ally, sometimes a weapon. But the real power resided in the rooms where words were not leaked, where strategies were silently tested, and where decisions carried consequences far beyond the camera lens. And then came the first critical moment of confrontation, a conversation that would set the tone for everything that followed. Every word, every inflection, every glance mattered. Allies shifted slightly in their seats, courtiers adjusted posture, and Meghan delivered a statement. A carefully crafted combination of assertion, challenge, and clarity. It was more than words. It was a declaration of intent. But the palace was not passive. Advisors countered, strategized, and attempted to regain control. Every move Meghan made was met with a calculated response, creating a tension so palpable it could have been sliced with a knife. Each side tested boundaries, gauged reactions, and probed for weakness. Yet Meghan remained unwavering. She was both a participant in the game and the one setting the rules. And amidst all this, there was emotion. Fear, courage, love, frustration, defiance, every feeling amplified by history, expectation, and the immediacy of stakes. Meghan navigated it with precision, but the human element, the uncertainty, the instinct, the relational complexity, added a volatility that no protocol manual could predict. So the questions multiply. How far will Meghan push? Will the palace adjust, retaliate, or compromise? What alliances will shift? What truths will be revealed? And most importantly, how will this first confrontation shape the narrative for the days, weeks, and months to come? But what came next inside those private walls would not just set the tone for this moment. It would ignite a chain reaction that nobody saw coming. And as Meghan prepared to make her next move, all eyes, inside and outside, were about to be forced to reckon with a force they had underestimated. Tensions that no cameras could capture were building. Behind the palace walls, away from flashing cameras and gossip columns, every word, every glance, and every pause carried weight. Meghan Markle had arrived, but the arrival was just the overture. The real drama was about to unfold in corridors where history and protocol clash with ambition and defiance. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be in a room where centuries of tradition meet someone unwilling to bend? That was the space Meghan stepped into. The air was thick with anticipation, uncertainty, and the faint hum of restrained emotions. Courtiers shifted nervously, advisors whispered strategies, and somewhere deeper in the palace, family members weighed the impact of every possible interaction. The balance of power was delicate. One misstep, one poorly chosen phrase, one unintended gesture could ignite conflict that would echo far beyond these walls. Harry was there too, a mixture of relief and apprehension flickering across his features. He had known Meghan would act, but even he couldn't predict the speed, the precision, the sheer intensity of her approach. For him, it was a storm of conflicting emotions, pride in her courage, fear for her safety, and tension over the consequences that might ripple through the family and the public alike. Their partnership had always been complex, a careful dance of mutual support, shared strategy, and love tested by scrutiny. Now, that dynamic was being amplified under pressure few could imagine. Inside the palace chambers, the first private conversations began. Meghan's presence alone was a challenge to centuries of protocol. The very act of showing up, unannounced in the sense of timing, was a subtle disruption to the hierarchy. But she was prepared. Every word she uttered, every glance she gave, was deliberate. She understood optics, psychology, and the subtleties of power better than most in the room. And yet, she was also human, and the emotional stakes were intense. Fear, anger, defiance, and hope all collided in a room charged with history and expectation. The palace was not idle. Advisors moved quickly, trying to anticipate her next step, crafting statements, preparing allies, and attempting to shape the narrative before it escaped beyond the walls. Meghan, however, was always one step ahead. She had rehearsed, imagined, and strategized. She had anticipated reactions, plotted countermeasures, and understood the pressures of legacy, reputation, and protocol. Every word was chosen not just to respond, but to assert control. What added complexity to the situation was the emotional layering. Family members who had been accustomed to quiet influence now faced a force they could not fully predict or control. Tension was everywhere, thin, taut, and ready to snap. Courtiers and aides could sense it. Their whispers were urgent but cautious. Every action was weighed against centuries of tradition in a modern world that demanded transparency and instant reaction. And Meghan was operating in both worlds simultaneously, leveraging emotional intelligence, strategic timing, and narrative awareness. Meanwhile, outside, the world was watching in fragmented glimpses. News outlets speculated. Social media erupted. Fans and critics debated endlessly. Yet none of it captured the true stakes. The subtle shifts in power, the whispered pressures, the delicate testing of boundaries. Meghan understood this. Public perception was a tool, but the real game was inside. Every calculated pause, every carefully crafted statement, every glance mattered far more than any headline. And then came the first real test of loyalty. Allies, both visible and hidden, were watching, ready to support, question, or hesitate. Who would side with her? Who would hesitate? Who would challenge her at exactly the wrong moment? This wasn't just about Meghan versus the palace. It was about alliances, strategy, and the human element that could shift the tide in an instant. Each subtle nod, each careful response, carried consequences for the unfolding drama. The emotional stakes were palpable. Fear of rejection, fear of misinterpretation, fear of historical backlash, all of it pressed in. But so did courage, determination, and the sharp clarity of purpose. Meghan's focus was unwavering. She knew the rules, but she wasn't playing by them. She knew the history, but she wasn't beholden to it. She understood the optics, but she moved beyond them. This wasn't rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It was a precise, calculated assertion of agency, timing, and control. Yet despite all preparation, unpredictability lingered in the air. Even with her strategy, even with her timing, human emotion is never fully controllable. Responses could surprise. Loyalties could shift. Missteps could unravel plans. Every breath, every pause, every glance was a potential pivot point. Meghan was navigating not just an institution, but a living, breathing network of humans, each with motives, fears, and ambitions of their own. And then, a moment of tension that no observer could have foreseen. A brief exchange, a carefully measured challenge, and suddenly the air was electric. Something unspoken passed between Meghan and a key figure in the room. A look, a slight change in tone, a subtle shift in posture. It was the kind of moment that defines outcomes. It was the kind of moment that could alter alliances, shift power, and set the stage for unprecedented conflict or reconciliation. Harry watched closely. He understood the stakes. He understood the risk. He also understood the skill. Meghan was not reacting impulsively. She was maneuvering with precision, leveraging emotional awareness, timing, and influence in ways that were quietly brilliant and terrifyingly effective. Every step, every word, every glance had purpose. And yet, the room remained a pressure cooker of history, expectation, and emotion. Even the palace advisors, experienced in centuries of protocol, were caught off guard. They had expected hesitation, negotiation, cautious conversation. They had not expected immediacy, decisiveness, and a force that combined strategy with emotional intensity. Meghan had arrived not just to be heard, but to assert power in a space where power was rarely questioned. And that disruption, calculated, deliberate, and intense, was already sending ripples through the institution. Outside, the world speculated endlessly. Commentators, pundits, social media armies, everyone had an opinion. And yet, none of it approached the truth, the raw emotional and strategic reality of what was unfolding in those rooms. Meghan's presence was a disruption, her voice a force, her decisions a pivot that could reshape relationships, alliances, and the narrative itself. The room was charged, every silence heavy, every glance loaded with meaning. Questions hung in the air. Who will blink first? Who will compromise? Who will assert authority? Who will be swayed by presence, intellect, and sheer emotional force? And how far would Meghan push, knowing that every move could escalate or resolve tensions in unpredictable ways? And then, the first breakthrough, a statement, a revelation, a calculated disclosure that would ripple far beyond the walls. It was subtle, precise, and explosive in consequence. Alliances shifted. Loyalties wavered. The palace realized, perhaps too late, that they were facing not just a challenge, but a strategic force they had underestimated. But the real shock was yet to come. Even with this breakthrough, with the tension high and the stakes higher, what happened next inside those walls would redefine the story completely. And as Meghan prepared for the next phase, all eyes, inside and outside, were about to witness a moment nobody could predict, a revelation that would ignite the next storm. The world was watching and judging. Headlines erupted the moment Meghan stepped off her plane. Sussex storms London. Meghan versus Palace. The battle begins. Royal titles at risk. Social media went into overdrive. Millions of opinions, memes, and hot takes flooding every platform. Some cheered her courage. Others condemned her audacity. But no one, not a single journalist, pundit, or royal commentator, truly understood what was happening behind closed doors. Because the story wasn't happening in front of cameras. It was unfolding in hushed corridors, behind locked doors, in rooms where centuries of tradition collided with a force that refused to bend. Every advisor, every aide, every senior palace official was watching, calculating, strategizing. The palace staff were used to crises, scandals, leaks, and public backlash, but nothing had prepared them for the immediacy, precision, and intensity of Meghan's arrival. Her presence alone was a statement. Meghan didn't need to speak to assert power. Her timing, her poise, and her unflinching gaze did more than words ever could. Yet when she did speak, Every sentence was measured, every phrase layered with strategy. There were no missteps, no hesitation. She knew that in this environment, silence could be as powerful as speech, but speech, when wielded correctly, could shape outcomes. The irony was impossible to ignore. Meghan, the woman who had once been vilified in the press for being too outspoken, too assertive, too different, was now rewriting the rules of engagement. She moved faster than anyone expected, anticipating every counter-move, leveraging every second to her advantage. And the palace, steeped in centuries of hierarchical expectation, was scrambling to keep up. Even the family dynamics were shifting. Harry, always aware of his own precarious balance, had to navigate loyalty, emotion, and strategy simultaneously. He knew the palace would perceive any misstep as weakness, yet he also understood that Meghan's decisiveness was a strength that could not be ignored. Their partnership, forged under relentless scrutiny, had never been tested like this, but it was holding a synchronized effort of strategy and resolve. Outside, the media frenzy intensified. Tweets exploded with speculation. Was Meghan negotiating behind the scenes? Did this change the line of succession? How would the Queen respond? Every detail was scrutinized, every rumor amplified. And yet, the real story, the nuanced chess game of alliances, emotional pressure, and strategic maneuvering, was invisible to the public eye. The palace's statement, carefully worded, attempted to assert authority, but Meghan's rapid response had already disrupted the narrative. Her allies were mobilizing, too. Friends, confidants, and trusted advisors were coordinating quietly, providing information, support, and contingency plans. Their presence wasn't overt, but it was influential. Every call, every message, every briefing added layers of strategy, ensuring that Meghan remained steps ahead. She understood that timing, optics, and alliances were critical, and that misalignment could be costly. Meanwhile, the palace tried to reassert control. Private memos circulated. Meetings convened. Contingency plans drafted. But Meghan's arrival had shifted the timeline. Every move they made was reactive rather than proactive. And in a palace accustomed to centuries of deliberate procedure, being forced into a reactive position created tension, anxiety, and uncertainty. Social media, of course, interpreted everything through a simplified lens. Opinions polarized. Supporters hailed Meghan as courageous and unstoppable. Critics framed her actions as reckless or disrespectful. Yet the truth, messy, complex, and high stakes, existed only inside those palace walls. The public could see drama, but they could not see strategy, calculation, or the subtle emotional currents that were reshaping relationships and alliances in real time. And the emotional stakes? They were massive. For Meghan, this wasn't just about titles. It was about autonomy, agency, and the right to control her own narrative. For the palace, it was about authority, tradition, and the preservation of centuries of institutional power. For Harry, it was about loyalty, love, and navigating the impossible intersection of family and strategy. And for every aide and advisor, it was about maintaining influence and avoiding missteps in a situation where every decision had consequences that could ripple across generations. Then came the first public ripple. A carefully released statement, not from Meghan, but from allies aligned with her strategy, hinted at the disruption inside the palace. The media seized on it instantly. Analysts debated, social media erupted, and the palace scrambled to respond. Every move Meghan made was calculated to create a narrative, to exert pressure, and to ensure that the world's attention, and the palace's, remained focused where she wanted it. Yet the tension wasn't only public. Inside, the palace walls were a pressure cooker of loyalty, fear, and frustration. Senior members whispered urgently, courtiers jostled to influence outcomes, and advisors weighed risks. They had not anticipated someone who would arrive so quickly, act so decisively, and manipulate the narrative so effectively. Meghan's presence had flipped the dynamic entirely. She was no longer reacting to palace decisions. She was dictating the pace, tone, and stakes. And here's where it gets truly dramatic. Even as the palace tried to regain control, Meghan had already anticipated their responses. Every statement they considered, every step they might take, every potential countermove had been accounted for. Her foresight was relentless, her strategy meticulous, her understanding of human behavior precise. She wasn't merely challenging the system, she was outmaneuvering it, moment by moment. But the human element remained volatile. Emotional undercurrents, anger, fear, loyalty, love, and defiance. Added complexity. Harry, Meghan, and even senior family members were all navigating personal stakes that intertwined with institutional stakes. Every conversation was a balancing act. Every pause carried meaning. Every glance could shift alliances or escalate tension. And just when it seemed the palace might regain footing, Meghan delivered another calculated signal. An unexpected move that forced attention, created urgency, and reminded everyone that the narrative was no longer theirs to control. Allies leaned in, advisors scribbled notes, and the air grew thick with anticipation. The palace had underestimated the force they were now facing: decisive, strategic, and emotionally intelligent. The media could report chaos. Social media could speculate endlessly. But the real drama, the subtle power shifts, the emotional confrontations, the carefully measured statements, was unfolding far from public view. And it was only just beginning. And yet, even in this whirlwind of strategy and tension, one truth became clear: the palace was no longer in full control. Meghan had shifted the balance, disrupted the rhythm, and challenged the hierarchy in ways that were both visible and invisible. Every second brought new complications, new pressures, and new opportunities for action. But just when everyone thought they could predict the next move, something happened: a private message, a whispered word, a decision behind closed doors, that changed the trajectory entirely. And what came next would set off a chain reaction no one anticipated, both inside the palace and across the world. Not everyone was against her. In fact, some of the palace's most unexpected allies were quietly rallying, shifting the balance in ways the public would never see. Meghan Markle had always understood the power of subtle alliances, the quiet nudges, the whispered reassurances, the calculated gestures that could tip a room without ever attracting attention. And now, inside the palace, those connections were coming into play, silently but with force. It started with the aides and advisors who had long felt marginalized, overlooked, or frustrated by the rigidity of royal protocol. Meghan's arrival gave them a reason to lean in, to act, to influence outcomes from behind the scenes. And she knew it. She understood human nature, the delicate interplay of loyalty and self-interest. Every smile, every nod, every carefully chosen phrase was a signal to those who were ready to support her quietly, strategically, and effectively. Meanwhile, friends from outside the palace, trusted confidants, advisors, and even former allies from the public sphere were working in tandem. Calls were made, messages sent, and strategies discussed. This was coordination on a level that few could imagine, bridging personal loyalty with tactical insight. It was quiet, meticulous, and incredibly powerful. Every move Meghan made was reinforced by a network of people who understood the stakes, the risks, and the opportunities. Inside, the palace felt the shift. There was a subtle but undeniable change in energy. Staff who had previously deferred to protocol began to hesitate, question, or even discreetly side with her. Courtiers whispered, advisors reevaluated, and some senior figures found themselves caught between tradition and the undeniable force of a woman who refused to be passive. Meghan's presence was disruptive not just by design, but by the ripple effect she had ignited. And yet, this was not without risk. The palace was aware that alliances could be fragile. One misstep, one misinterpreted gesture, and loyalty could fracture. Meghan knew this. She had to move carefully, maintaining credibility, command, and influence while navigating the minefield of internal politics. Timing, clarity, and precision were everything. Every word, every pause, every look could strengthen or undermine her position. But the emotional stakes were equally intense. Alliances are rarely just transactional. They carry history, emotion, and expectation. Some who aligned with her were motivated by loyalty, others by shared frustration with palace rigidity, and others by personal ambition. Meghan had to navigate these currents delicately, reading intent, assessing trust, and predicting reactions in real time. It was a masterclass in emotional intelligence under extreme pressure. Harry played a critical role as well. His presence wasn't just symbolic. He was a partner, strategist, and emotional anchor. In private, he helped assess the room, gauge reactions, and provide insight into potential vulnerabilities and opportunities. Their partnership had always been complex, balancing love, strategy, and shared vulnerability. But now, it was operating at peak intensity, each move carefully calculated to support objectives, protect allies, and mitigate risks. The first sign of disruption came during a meeting meant to assess reactions to her arrival. Courtiers and senior advisors had expected tension, hesitation, or perhaps a retreat. Instead, Meghan engaged with clarity, authority, and measured emotion. She asked pointed questions, subtly revealing gaps in information, misalignments in priorities, and weaknesses in protocol. She didn't attack. She illuminated. And that illumination began to shift the room. Allies leaned forward, opponents faltered, and even the most seasoned palace officials were forced to reassess their assumptions. And then came the surprises, moments that nobody outside the palace could have anticipated. A whispered suggestion from a junior aide, a previously unnoticed ally stepping forward with crucial insight, a private communication that shifted negotiation dynamics. All of it compounded the pressure. Meghan had not just arrived. She had orchestrated a web of influence that subtly, yet powerfully, altered the balance of control. The emotional intensity only grew. Family members, long accustomed to controlling narrative and maintaining authority, now faced someone who refused to play by the rules. Fear, frustration, and surprise collided in the air. Allies and advisors navigated a complex dance of loyalty, strategy, and self-preservation. Every conversation, glance, and gesture was magnified by centuries of tradition and the weight of public expectation. And then came a pivotal moment. An unexpected ally, one who had been quietly observing, provided information that changed the dynamic entirely. It wasn't public knowledge. It wasn't documented. It was insider intelligence, subtle but decisive, that shifted both perception and strategy. Meghan, with her characteristic precision, acted on it immediately, leveraging timing, optics, and emotional impact. The palace, caught slightly off guard, scrambled to recalibrate. Meanwhile, social media and public opinion continued to swirl. Headlines speculated, debates raged, and pundits dissected every move. Yet all of this was secondary. The real battle, the strategic, emotional, and political maneuvering, was happening inside rooms the public could never see. Meghan's understanding of narrative, timing, and alliances meant she was already operating on a level beyond the comprehension of external observers. But the real shock was yet to come. Even with allies aligned and strategy unfolding, there was a move that nobody had anticipated. A decision, a conversation, or perhaps even a simple gesture that would not just disrupt the palace's plans, but redefine the stakes entirely. The ripple effects would extend beyond the immediate room, beyond the palace, and into a global audience still trying to understand what was happening. Meghan had arrived to act decisively. She had allies ready. She had strategy mapped. And yet, the unpredictability of human reaction, emotion, and ambition remained. The tension was palpable, almost suffocating, as every participant navigated an increasingly complex web of influence, loyalty, and stakes. Every choice mattered. Every word carried consequence. And then, in a quiet but decisive moment, the first major shift occurred. One that changed the balance of power, altered expectations, and forced everyone to reckon with the reality that Meghan Markle was not just a participant in this drama. She was shaping it, controlling it, and redefining it on her own terms. But not everyone approved, and not everyone would stay loyal. And what came next would test alliances, reveal hidden motives, and set the stage for confrontation the palace never anticipated. The tension in the palace had reached a near-boiling point. Meghan Markle had not only arrived, she had disrupted centuries of ritualized control, shaken alliances, and forced the institution to confront its own assumptions. But the stakes were now higher than ever. Every interaction, every whispered conversation, every carefully calculated step had the potential to reshape relationships, power dynamics, and even public perception. Have you ever felt the weight of being watched, judged, and analyzed every second of your life? That was Meghan's reality. She had entered a space where every word could be scrutinized, every expression dissected, and every decision interpreted as either defiance or compliance. And yet, she moved with a confidence that was almost frightening. She knew that hesitation would be exploited, doubt weaponized, and patience tested. Timing, precision, and psychological acuity were her weapons, and she wielded them relentlessly. Inside, the palace's senior advisors scrambled. They had expected hesitation, perhaps negotiation, but Meghan offered neither. She engaged with clarity, poise, and deliberate focus. Every question she asked highlighted gaps in knowledge, weaknesses in assumptions, and the subtle fragilities of a centuries-old system designed to maintain order. Her presence alone reframed conversations, shifting discussions from theoretical protocol to real-time strategy. Harry was at her side, but his role was more complex than merely supportive. He acted as both shield and amplifier. His presence reassured allies, subtly countered palace maneuvers, and helped moderate the intensity of confrontations. Their partnership, forged in public scrutiny, was now executing at a level of precision few could comprehend. Every move, every glance, every shared understanding was part of a carefully orchestrated approach to influence, negotiation, and control. And yet, even with all the planning, unpredictability remained a constant. Human behavior, after all, is never fully controllable. Emotions, personal ambitions, and instinct could shift the dynamic in seconds. Allies could falter, opponents could surprise, and Meghan had to navigate it all, simultaneously managing the palace, the media, her family, and the global audience watching every development with bated breath. The first formal meeting began in a quiet chamber. Courtiers, advisors, and senior family members were present. The expectation was measured discussion, careful negotiation, and subtle assertion of authority. But Meghan arrived with a different agenda. She opened with a concise, pointed question, a simple line that immediately reframed the discussion. The room went silent. Every advisor leaned in. Every glance was measured. She had set the tone without shouting, without confrontation, yet with unmistakable command. And then the subtle manipulations began. Meghan's questions, observations, and gestures weren't just about immediate outcomes. They were psychological probes, testing loyalties, revealing weaknesses, and nudging the room toward calculated revelations. She understood not just the hierarchy, but the emotions that underpinned it. Fear, loyalty, pride, resentment. All were tools, and she wielded them with meticulous care. Outside, social media buzzed incessantly. The public was unaware of the strategic precision at play, seeing only the sensational headlines. Meghan challenges the palace, royal titles and turmoil, Sussexes versus tradition. But in reality, Meghan was several steps ahead. Her mastery of timing, optics, and influence meant that even the palace's most experienced strategists were forced into a reactive mode. They had expected to control her arrival, but she had inverted the situation entirely. And then came a crucial revelation. Information that shifted assumptions, recalibrated expectations, and created new opportunities. Meghan had accessed insight that palace insiders had assumed would remain private, enabling her to anticipate moves before they were made. Her intelligence was not just strategic, it was tactical, emotional, and operational all at once. This was not merely a confrontation. It was a calculated campaign unfolding in real time. The palace, while seasoned, was unprepared for this level of nuance. Advisors whispered in corners. Senior officials hesitated before making moves. Courtiers reevaluated their positions. Meghan had changed the rhythm of the room, the tone of the institution, and the psychology of every participant. Her presence was simultaneously subtle and forceful, strategic and emotional, disruptive yet controlled. Harry noticed the shifts as well. He observed how allies who had previously been passive were now engaging, how opponents' confidence wavered, and how subtle cues could alter the room's dynamic. He understood that Meghan's strategy was not linear. It was a multi-layered orchestration of influence, perception, and timing. Every response, every pause, every subtle gesture served a purpose, advancing a larger, invisible agenda. But human emotion, even when guided by strategy, is unpredictable. As Meghan pressed forward, subtle tensions arose. Frustrations surfaced, doubts whispered, and rivalries flared beneath the surface. Allies who had seemed steadfast now wavered. Courtiers who had been confident now hesitated. The room became a pressure cooker of power, fear, and ambition, and every decision carried immediate consequence. And yet, Meghan thrived in the volatility. She had always understood that unpredictability is an advantage when wielded with skill. Her emotional acuity, strategic foresight, and precise timing allowed her to anticipate, guide, and shape reactions in ways the palace had not seen before. She was not reacting to events. She was creating them, and controlling the tempo of the confrontation with a mastery few could match. The first escalation occurred when a senior figure, attempting to assert authority, inadvertently revealed a vulnerability. Meghan seized it, not with aggression, but with clarity. She asked questions, provided context, and highlighted inconsistencies that made the weakness undeniable. The shift was subtle yet profound. Allies were emboldened, opponents hesitated, and the palace, despite its centuries of hierarchy, realized that the narrative was no longer theirs to fully control. Outside the walls, the world remained oblivious to the strategic brilliance at play. Social media debated motives, speculated on outcomes, and sensationalized drama, but the real stakes, alliances, vulnerabilities, and power, were invisible. Meghan's understanding of this duality, public perception versus private influence, was a cornerstone of her approach. She navigated both with precision, ensuring that every move advanced objectives while maintaining a public narrative that fueled curiosity, speculation, and engagement. And then, just as the tension reached a critical peak, Meghan made another move. A statement, a subtle disclosure, a gesture that shifted dynamics yet again. Allies leaned in, opponents faltered, and the room collectively realized that they were no longer negotiating on traditional terms. Meghan had altered the battlefield entirely, creating a new set of rules that others would have to follow, or risk losing influence entirely. But the palace was resilient. Experienced, meticulous, and steeped in history, they were not about to concede completely. Strategies shifted, counter-moves were planned, and subtle alliances were activated. Meghan's next decision would not only test loyalty and influence, it would ignite a confrontation that would ripple far beyond the walls. And in that charged moment, one thought dominated the room. Meghan Markle was no longer just a challenger. She was a force reshaping the rules, testing limits, and asserting power in ways that the monarchy had never experienced before. But what happened next would escalate tensions to unprecedented heights. And no one, inside or outside the palace, saw it coming. The corridors of the palace had never felt this alive, or this tense. Meghan Markle's presence was more than a disruption. It was a force that altered rhythm, energy, and expectations in ways that had ripple effects beyond anyone's anticipation. Every step she took, every gesture she made, was under the microscope. Not just by the media, but by centuries of protocol, tradition, and power dynamics that had been meticulously maintained for generations. And now, all of it was being tested. She moved deliberately, walking through hallways that had seen decades of ceremonial reverence. But she wasn't ceremonial. She was strategic. Each glance, each pause, each subtly measured expression was designed to communicate authority without overt confrontation. In a palace built on hierarchy and precedent, Meghan was rewriting the language of influence in real time. Harry observed closely, a mixture of awe, anxiety, and calculation. They had always functioned as a unit, a partnership forged in the crucible of public scrutiny, but now the stakes were unprecedented. Every move Meghan made had ramifications not just for titles, roles, or protocol, but for the emotional fabric of family relationships and the public narrative surrounding them. Their synchronization was nearly flawless. Every glance and gesture communicated unspoken understanding and strategy. The first major challenge arrived in the form of a senior family member, someone who had long wielded influence in subtle yet powerful ways. This individual had assumed that Meghan would act cautiously, perhaps even defensively, and was prepared to assert authority in response. But Meghan's arrival had inverted expectations. She neither hesitated nor flinched. Instead, she engaged with a calm assertiveness that both commanded attention and exposed vulnerabilities. It began with a question, simple yet loaded. Have we considered the long-term consequences of our current approach? The room paused. Every aide, advisor, and courtier instinctively leaned in. It was not just a question. It was a challenge to assumptions, a probe into strategy, and a subtle assertion of intellectual dominance. Those who thought they controlled the conversation realized almost immediately that control had shifted. The palace responded with rehearsed statements, carefully crafted phrasing meant to reassert authority. But Meghan was ready. She anticipated each line, each tone, each nuance, and countered with a combination of emotional intelligence, factual precision, and strategic timing. The balance of power, already delicate, shifted further. Allies leaned in, opponents hesitated, and the room became a dynamic battlefield of influence, psychology, and protocol. The emotional intensity was impossible to ignore. Fear, pride, frustration, and loyalty interwove with strategy, creating a pressure so tangible it could be felt in the air. Meghan understood this fully. She knew that emotional stakes often outweighed logic in decision-making. She used this insight, subtly leveraging empathy, tension, and anticipation to guide responses and reveal truths that others sought to keep hidden. And then came a revelation, an insight delivered quietly by a palace aide, one who had observed long enough to understand Meghan's strategic brilliance. It was information that could shift negotiation dynamics, expose hidden agendas, and recalibrate loyalties. Meghan processed it instantly, her mind mapping contingencies, weighing options, and anticipating reactions. Within seconds, she had transformed it into a strategic advantage, subtly but powerfully asserting control over the unfolding narrative. Outside the walls, the world speculated endlessly. Headlines screamed, social media erupted, and the global audience